Hello, and welcome to our EDM webinar titled Data Controls, Generative AI, and Financial Service Needs. I welcome Mike Maritin, co-founder of EDM Council. He will be kicking off the presentation. Over to you, Mike.
Thank you, Angie, and welcome to our EDM Council and EDM webinar audience for today. So why are we here? This is a phenomenally exciting time. If you wind the clock back not too long ago, around October, November of 2022 last year, there were some very significant announcements with ChatGPT and generative AI. And over the last several quarters, there's been essentially an explosion of use cases and opportunities all around this new ability of large language models and the ability to leverage them for many different parts of the business. Now, in the financial services industry, regulated industry, there are some significant responsibilities to do this in a responsible way. The challenges include ensuring that generative AI models are used responsibly and ethically. There's a regulatory mandate to protect sensitive data from any unauthorized access. And there's also an ensuring that generative AI models are compliant with any of the regulations across jurisdictions. So in today's discussion, we're going to discuss these both opportunities and the challenges and explore how data controls can help financial services firms address this and leverage this capability with trust. So with no further ado, let me address and introduce our panelists for today. First, starting with Chris Napoli. Welcome, Chris. Good to have you. And Chris is the head of wealth and asset management at Snowflake. So Chris, good to have you. Next, I'd like to introduce Jocelyn Houle, who is the senior director of product management at Securiti. Jocelyn, great to have you here as well. Welcome. And I'd also like to introduce Irakli Nadereishvili, who is the managing director of global banking platform at JPMorgan Chase. So Irakli, great to have you as well on today's webinar, and welcome.
Hey team, great to be here.
Awesome. So to set a little more context for this discussion, Jocelyn, I'm going to turn it over to you. I think you have some interesting points to share.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I'm really excited to talk about this topic. Most of my career, I've been a tech or strategy lead, working with very large-scale financials as they create data products, industry standard decision-making systems. And that's most of what I focus on at Securiti as well. So this is an exciting topic for us right now. And I think it has particular interest to those working in the finance sector. So let me talk a little bit about that. The question is, why are we talking about this generative AI in terms of financials? Well, I think you all know there's an amazing upside opportunity, but we're all struggling, I think, particularly because finance is so highly regulated, to move forward in what is essentially a sort of high risk, low information environment. In some ways, that's the sweet spot for finance. That's where we spend a lot of time trying to figure out more, faster than the other guy, how to grab some margin. But in other ways, because we're so highly regulated, it's nervous making. So what I can tell you, looking at, and there's a lot of amazing reports out there about the adoption of Gen AI, the opportunities. We do think it's going to be really impactful. Finance is a little bit special, though. So while lots of organizations are going to dig in here, probably finance will be the first to start tackling how to build enterprise data products. And the reason for that is because, as I said, this is the bread and butter for financial services. There's also just such a wide variety of use cases available in financial services. You can identify them throughout the risk profile of the organization, as well as the maturity, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So one thing I also wanted to kind of lay out in the introduction here and level set here is that, we all know, there's a huge consumer side and a lot of excitement around generative AI. I myself talk to ChatGPT on a regular basis. The pressure to figure out what's going on with generative AI is pretty high, or seems high. But I wanted to share with you a little bit around current adoption. Despite the massive growth, and you can see on the left-hand side, right, ChatGPT had one of the fastest evolutions to 100 million users of any technology we've seen. On the right-hand side, what you'll see is 10% drop in usage in June, 10% additional drop in July. So it's pretty clear that the consumer use cases may be cooling off. And the reason that matters to this audience is a couple of things. Enterprise adoption is fundamentally going to be generative AI adoption. That's the heaviest lever. And so the people on this call, the audience in this webinar, are the key enablers as they figure out how to test this and start their use cases while sidestepping some of the major risks. So let me talk a little bit about what, and just a last thing I'll say here is like, what do you need if you want to proceed while managing risk? Well, you're going to need two frameworks. You're going to need a way to think about the risks and a way to think about the upside and what to do next. Our customers are telling us that these risks fit into four main buckets: model risk, data risk, regulatory risk, and sort of bad actor or prompt injection risk internal to your organization. I know our panelists are going to cover all of these, but this is one way of thinking about the checklist of concerns. The other thing they're really going to need once they understand where their adoption risks may lie is some kind of great framework to move forward and proceed in a way that's orderly and what crosses these complex organizations. And we really recommend to our customers, they use the CDMC framework. Mike, I know that you've collaborated with Snowflake and Chase and as well as Securiti on this. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that framework to help organizations proceed.
Yes, certainly, Jocelyn, and thanks for the shout out. We're going to put into the chat the link. This is actually a free framework. The EDM Council is a nonprofit trade association. The backstory is about 2 years ago, the EDM Council was approached by several firms looking to hyperscale their cloud and analytic and AI environments. But it was absolutely an imperative to have a series of both governance and data risk controls that would be in place. So we said, hey, we would start out with a working group, at least had to have 10 companies. It couldn't just be one cloud company. We were asking for more. And to our surprise, in the course of about 60 to 90 days, we had 100 companies show up to build and work on this. And in fact, in total, we had the top major cloud companies: Amazon, Google, Microsoft. In fact, all three joined our board of directors. They put a half a dozen to a dozen engineers. And then we had 17 of the 30 largest financial institutions in the world. Irakli, JPMorgan was one of the participants, but so was HSBC and many other firms throughout the world. And we also then started briefing the results with the financial regulators, notably the Federal Reserve, that's a member of the council, the SEC, the Bank of England, the European Central Bank, so that we can assure that the right controls were in place to meet financial regulation across jurisdictions. This was the bullseye of the result. You'll see in the middle is that the framework is comprised of 6 components. Data governance and accountability is at the heart. That's the first of those components. Then you'll see that anything and everything that's injected and used into cloud or generated in cloud needs to be cataloged and classified. And if you do that appropriately at the beginning, then allows you to set up your accessibility and usage rights, your protection and data privacy provisions, what degrees of encryption that you need. And then data goes through an entire life cycle, including retirement. So you have to manage data lineage, data quality, and then in the data and technical architecture, how do you manage your overall controls around managing data costs and eventually the retirement of data? This resulted in these 14 key controls to be recommended as automations. And in the course of the last year, we've had Amazon, first, by the way, Chris, credit to Snowflake, the very first company to announce the controls across both Microsoft Azure, Amazon Web Services, and Google was Snowflake. Securiti, and Jocelyn, credit to you and your team, was highly involved in building out control monitoring against these 14 controls across multiple environments. And good news, every company now that's listening in on this call, you can download this framework and use it with your CTO, with your cloud operations teams to assure. And most notably, you can go to your cloud providers and to companies like Securiti and Snowflake, and you can ask for these controls. They've been pre-built by many companies at this point. So Jocelyn, really back to you, but the good news is in today's webinar, we wanted to share that this resource of protecting sensitive data across multiple jurisdictions, there's now a data risk control framework that's available and represented through the CDMC initiative that all these companies work together on.
Thanks so much, Mike. It might make sense to just double click on, so much has happened so fast. I'm sure many people in the audience I'm sorry, should I wait for the poll?
Yeah, the poll's coming in. And by the way, we're going to do two polls. The first poll is you personally. Do you use any of the generative AI capabilities? Have you downloaded ChatGPT? Have you built either a marketing letter or an internal document or a plan? Anything personally? There's no right answer here, and these are be kept anonymous. So the options are not at all. Are you experimenting both at home and or work? Are you regularly using it in your job? We'll give it a moment. And then Jocelyn and Chris, I'm going to ask you all to give a few comments on where our audience might be. It's almost a bell curve. I think we're there. Let me just see if we can finalize the results. Angie, just to confirm that. And here's what I'm seeing. The highest voted response is experimenting, either at home and at work, nearly half of our audience. And then we have about a third that haven't done it at all. So there's an opportunity there to explore and test things. And interesting, in a short 9 months, nearly 1 out of 5, at 16%, are involved in doing it regularly, leveraging generative AI regularly. So Chris, anything surprising about that, or is that what you were figuring you'd hear?
Yeah, it's similar. It's what I would anticipate to hear, but the point I would like to make is actually for the third of all of us not using generative AI, this is about as comparable to when the internet came out and not using email. And the reason why I highlight that is because most of the things that you learn that are levered in business or through professional development, you learn them post going to university. The thing about generative AI and its capability to learn and generate a response based off facts, well, that's basically going to school, right? So more importantly, it's going to be understanding how to use the tool to help accelerate your production. And the earlier you start to use that, the higher probability that you won't be left behind, right? And that's the reason why I would like to highlight that along the lines. This is transformational in terms of how humans will be able to consume and implement and provide information, both professionally and personally. And I just would like to highlight that to start.
Awesome. Chris, thank you. Jocelyn, any comments? Are these poll results what you expected to see, or any surprises?
No, I'm really excited to see how many people are starting to experiment. I just echo what Chris said. And just a quick, there's some really great resources on YouTube that will just give you tutorials and help you type it in. So no need for grand, original thought here. You can easily get started in 20 minutes just messing around with it.
Yeah, and I'd like to add something to that. I use a Monica chatbot just to make sure I have the productivity formula correct of A equals human capital times labor times technology. There are easier ways with wrappers now to lever LLM for daily research and answers than what originally came out back in October and November.
Well, so my takeaway from the poll results, and Chris, both you and Jocelyn, your comments is 2/3 of our audience are doing something now, and a third are right on the cusp of doing it. So, and I think, Jocelyn, your advice is great, which is it doesn't have to be grand design. Go out to YouTube, look at some videos. There are simple training courses. Whether you're wanting to issue and write up a plan on a particular topic, it's really phenomenal. You can actually say things like limit it to X number of words, include these kind of references. It will give you as good as you're able to prompt. And that's something to be thinking about as you're looking at this capability. So it's easy to start the exploration. Now on to more serious subject, which is use cases in the financial services market. And Irakli, there's a really interesting chart here about maturity. Do you mind sharing with the audience your take on the financial services use cases that are out there and what our audience can start thinking about if they're working at financial services firms?
Yeah, sure. So first, obligatory disclaimer. I'm responsible for everything I say. Nobody else is responsible in the world for everything I say, mostly because nobody wants to be responsible for anything I say. But with that out of the way, yeah, when I look at, so this is a great graph showing some of the current trends of how people use generative AI. And when I look at this, the way I like to think about like major categories in which those use cases fall is what I call the maturity pyramid of generative AI adoption, right? So let me explain what I mean by that. So basically, I think that there are three levels of adopting generative AI, and starting at the very top, the most complicated, it's the development of the specialized skills and specialized large language models, right? That's people who have not really spent a lot of time with LLM, like they may think that like that's what you need to do if you really are getting into it. But the reality is very few people are actually doing it right now. And the reason is it's super expensive. It requires a lot of expertise, right? And there are also the risks related to developing custom models are probably the highest, right? So the risks that I would be worried about when doing something like that is the interpretability and the transparency of the model, which are the most difficult things to tackle in the AI right now. So going a little bit lower in something that's a little bit more attainable, I'd say that generative AI right now is pretty usable for process automation and optimization. So the use cases would be customer support, various marketing use cases, risk assessment, fraud defense, assistance in fraud defense. Risks here are a little bit different. I would say that data quality and data veracity are probably the biggest concerns if I was doing this, right? And they can lead to things like hallucinations, reliability issues, or ethical concerns when there's not enough quality data. Models sometimes seem to be very happy to make things up. So I call it the toddler effect of the AI. They have a problem saying, I don't know, so they start imagining things. But it's still very usable because some of these risks can be mitigated by post-moderation by humans. So the way I would recommend using this categories is more think about this as an assistive technology, right? So if we compare this to auto driving, like not fully auto driving, but showing you the blind spots and stopping you if you don't pay attention, like this is more that kind of things, right? It can assist you greatly, but you may still want to double check what the generative AI is telling you. So that's the second category. And at the bottom of the pyramid, which I think is where most of the success is right now, and probably the risks are the lowest, is what I call, I basically call it prompting-driven programming. I don't think anybody else calls it that. But what the idea here is that basically, the way that most of the enterprise programming or programming in the financial sector has been happening for the last 15 years is API driven, right? So we build a lot of APIs, and then people can put these APIs together in many different ways, or computers can talk to each other's APIs, and then a lot of really interesting things happen in payments or other areas. I think in the next 5-10 years, that's going to change, right? I think that generative AI is already able to write pretty good code, and a lot of people are actually worried about its ability to write code. But I think we're thinking it wrongly, at least at this point, like what it will be writing. I don't think that generative AI will be writing Linux kernel anytime soon, right? But what we'll be doing is instead of us coding against those APIs, a lot of which are already available, we can get to the point where we talk to some LLM model, right? ChatGPT or something else, probably something more enterprise. And we can tell them like, hey, I want the US dollars rate right now, and the weather right now, and like the stock price of this and that, and like put everything together, and then I want to figure out something else, right? And if that model has been fed the documentation to all of those APIs, the model itself already knows how to program, given the good documentation. It probably can do a very good job giving you the code that can do that, and you can quickly review it and then run it, rather than spending hours and hours of like learning the API documentation and doing things like that. So I think that that like the lowest level of the pyramid is something that we're the closest that will bring a lot of productivity. The risks there are very low because basically it gives us the jump start, but you can review that code and there are very few ethical considerations there. I think it also opens a pretty big market in that documentation that you feed into these models, like people can monetize it. So it could create some interesting commercialization opportunities.
Really fascinating, Irakli. Jocelyn, Chris, this is a really interesting page. We're about to do a poll, but before we do that, any comments or thoughts for our audience about what's up on the screen right now?